Hey, Jimenez, how are you doing? Good to see you again.
Great to see you, Marcus. Thanks for having me.
And welcome to today's Screen Time interview sponsored by Enscape. And I'm glad you're in your chair, Jimenez, because there was a bit of a panic then when you were rushing around trying to put your dog out. What's what's with your dog?
Oh, she's great. She's just a little barky sometimes, and I didn't want her to, disrupt the interview.
So tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do, and also your setup. Where are you calling in from?
I'm calling in from Los Angeles, California. My name is Jimenez Lai. I have a small practice called Bureau Spectacular. I guess the things we do range from spoons to cities in terms of our proposals. But I also teach. I teach primarily at UCLA, sometimes at Columbia University, other times at other schools, but like recently Texas Tech, for example. But yeah, I teach, I work, I write, I draw comics.
You draw comics?
I draw comics, yeah.
For fun or as a means of, have you been published?
Yeah, sure. A few years ago, I published a comic book titled Citizens of No Place. Within it, talk about architecture, talk about, let's say, concerns of the world and concerns of issues and things like that.
Ah, is that in your presentation?
Yeah, I'll show some of the cartoon comics.
Oh, great. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
And we were just talking about your backdrop earlier. So you've got a very nice, clean apartment there. But you said we were all at Space Popular's interview yesterday. They sent the benchmark in terms of having a cool backdrop, didn't they?
So good. Yeah, theirs is the best.
I've chickened out by having this green screen thing behind me.
That's what I should have done. Yeah.
Anyway, why don't you show us your presentation, show us your work, and then we can have a little chat about that after.
All right. I guess there are 5 talking points I want to present today. One is, cartoon or comics about comics and architecture, which we sort of began. I'll also talk a little bit about gravity and time, which are some of the topics within the comics that I've drawn. From there, there's maybe I'll touch on a little bit about microstates and disappearing microstates. It's one of the current issues that I'm working on at the moment. I'll also, so there's 5 talking points I'll present. The 4th one being this obscure but super interesting Dutch philosophy group that I kind of came in contact with. They call themselves metamodernism. Finally, I'll talk about the idea of chill, like chill vibes, chill things. But I guess maybe going a little bit further back, I'll show a few slides to introduce the work that I do. This is, these are some of the things that I've done over the past few years, ranging from houses that we design, propose, installations. For example, at the Taiwan Pavilion, at the Venice Biennale, I represented Taiwan 1 year. Earlier I was talking about spoons to cities, objects at the scale of lamps, or proposals like installations from PS1, and so on and so forth. And the cartoons and architecture stuff, I would venture to say something like utopian proposals are often hyperbolic exaggerations of existing conditions, not so dissimilar from the way that we might find political cartoons in journalism, the way that people would exaggerate certain aspects about politicians or the society in order to make a commentary. And I think this idea of utopia, or utopian sort of journalism, utopic journalism as a form of re-representation of the world, or as a form of cartoon, to me is what has always fascinated me about, the medium of drawing comics. So these are some of the diagrams I had to work out in order to understand, the framework from which I would work. So as I mentioned, Citizens of No Place was a graphic novel. It was about, tall buildings, tall buildings where, floating cities and things like that. But for this time period, I was working primarily on cartoons about architecture. In other words, cartoon was the medium and architecture happens to be the subject matter. But later on, I discovered that, the graphic sensibility of cartoon in itself is a design guideline or framework. So cartoonish architecture became something that I started working towards instead of cartoons about architecture. So on one hand, cartoons about architecture treats cartoon as a medium, but then cartoonish architecture treats architecture as a medium and cartoon being the sensibility. So these are some of the things. And, just speaking of hyperbolic exaggerations of existing conditions from a journalistic point of view, one of the things I'm about to work on with a group here in LA called DCBID is that they've commissioned me to write a manifesto about downtown LA. So this is something that I'm going to be working on this year. But sorry, I'm skipping ahead because I don't want to take way too much time. Some of the cartoons that I've drawn are stories about gravity. Being inside of a spaceship means that your relationship with plans, sections, elevations, all becomes sort of floating. It pushed me to be building some of these installations where the room in itself challenged the notion of orientation. Or other, spaceship stories involve time displacement, time travel, when people return from their spaceships so far in the future that the society has disappeared. Where future beings might be asking about, archaeological versus documentation differences of architecture. What was architecture in the past? And from these types of ideas, I was able to propose other installations. This one got built recently in Seoul, Korea, titled Future Archaeologists. I wanted to provide a series of datums that would elevate us in time. And because our relationship with archaeology has always been a relationship with the ground. We always dig because sediments, collect, and eventually our past is underground. So by presenting datums that would be in the air, or by excavating into the air, we might be presenting points in time in the future. And so where this point in time that we proposed, obviously, these kinds of ideas have been covered widely in film, where a representation of time past is a representation of ground gained. So yeah, the datum that we introduced eventually was something like 5,000 years in the future, the point in time where you'll be standing. And the site here happens to be the palace of the last king of Korea. And we were invited by the Museum of Modern Contemporary Art under the curatorial direction of Jihoy Lee. The third topic I wanted to cover briefly is this idea of the microstate. And I'm calling it found story because, based on obviously the philosophies of Charles Fourier, talking about a city instead of a building. And so in some of these comic stories that I've drawn, I've proposed oversized buildings that contain a massive number of people. Here you can faintly see the skyline of Manhattan because this tower is the extrusion of Central Park for 12 kilometers, being able to contain roughly 80 million humans, which is, just a little bit smaller than Germany. So the building inside of the city inside of the building you know, means that zoning might be a section issue rather than a plan issue. Typologies of shapes of architecture has also probably to be thought of in section instead of plan only. And so some of these ideas are now beginning to take place in the ways I teach. For instance, this is a studio I taught at UCLA, or some of the discussions that I'm having with government agencies. So for example, I've been really involved in talking with the country, not directly, but through other government agencies, Tuvalu, the country Tuvalu. It's a microstate that's on the verge of disappearance. And maybe there are ways that we can talk through architecture, talk about, let's say, prosthetic solutions to help this country maintain its territory. Yeah, the fourth talking point I wanted to just put on the table and see where it goes, like I mentioned, was this discovery of a somewhat obscure but super interesting Dutch group. They call themselves Metamodernism. I mean, it really, I would say, started out with like super normal projects. You know, here I was working with the Taiwanese government and talking about this idea of adding buildings to buildings. You know, people add buildings to buildings all the time. In LA, people add buildings behind building. In Taipei, people add buildings on top of buildings. But so this idea of adding buildings to buildings, you know, we're adding, let's say, some symbolically meaningful objects to buildings, took us to a place where we proposed a number of options as to how we might be able to put buildings on top of buildings. But the additive process, you know, got us somewhere else. I mean, concurrently, I guess around the same time, I also worked on an exhibition at SF MoMA where we worked on a number of, not just adding buildings to buildings, but adding sensibilities to sensibilities. And the range between high art to pop art to everyday objects, you know, adding buildings to buildings became sort of described by some of my colleagues as a postmodern approach. You know, so the idea of postmodern versus modern, or postmodern versus postmodern is a discussion that's being had amongst the contemporary cultural theorists. And, you know, Shia LaBeouf happens to be a central figure in all this conversation. And it took me to a place where I got to meet Timotheus Vermeulen and Robin Vanden Acker through the support of Columbia University. We had a symposium talking about, you know, because architecture is always slightly behind other disciplines, you know. So by the time that literature experienced modernism, where cinema experienced postmodernism, it takes a little while for architecture to catch up. Not just because, you know, our discipline takes longer. I mean, buildings take really long time to build. So I found this super interesting, you know, and one of the key points that I've learned from talking with them is that the oscillation between irony and sincerity, whereas in postmodernism, irony is an idea, or irony is a rhetorical device to subvert the relationship with modernism, where if modernism had an idea that there's a grand narrative, irony is necessary to subvert that grand narrative in order to introduce multiple narratives. But metamodernism seems to oscillate between irony and sincerity. So, I mean, it got me to also think about the last few years and a lot of my colleagues who seem to possess very similar sensibilities, where, you know, they might be speaking in a way that sounds ironic, but their messages are entirely sincere. Finally, I just want to, you know, this last talking point, chill, the idea of the chill vibes. You know, for those who spend time on YouTube, you might have encountered such channels as Chill Cow or Chill Hop Music. And there's an interesting kind of set of aesthetic properties, you know, about the chill vibes. And I'm trying to understand it currently, maybe harness it in ways that can be applied to not just ways in which we think about our rooms, but maybe ways in which we can think about our buildings. If there's a possibility to think about some kind of a chill set or chill feelings. And so this was a exhibition that I had put together for Volume Gallery in Chicago. I worked with Volume Gallery to develop a series of furniture pieces. This is the extrude couch. This is the St. Sebastian coat hanger. Coat hangers often are just heads, but I thought it would be kind of interesting that instead of hanging them by the head, we're hanging them by the halo. St. Sebastian, obviously, with the arrows. Tables that are huddling with each other. I mean, but it might take a little too long to talk about exactly what we're thinking about when we think about the chill vibes. It might, could be pun related, could be color, could be how things get photographed. We also collaborate with Urban Fabric Rugs on some of these carpets that we produce. But maybe to finish the story of the chill vibes, maybe the story of the chill vibes is not just a aesthetics or color, but also a structural issue. For something to be slouching, for someone to look like they're slouching or chilling, the way that Michelangelo, for example, chills because of contrapposto, because of the shoulder line and hip line not being parallel with each other. Maybe there's a structural story to be told. The bodily postures of intensity, for example, can maybe be translated in ways in which we think about endoskeletons and other structural issues. This was what you're looking at right now is a installation that we built for Coachella, Coachella Valley Music Festival. We're invited by Rafi Lair and work with Paul Clemente on this project. Anyway, I think that's about it. I was going to play this short clip. Some of the students that I'm working with right now, we're sort of playing out the chill stories. Let me just fast forward ahead. Well, anyway, I'll stop here.
Cool, thank you for that. There was a lot of complex ideas and long words and abstract concepts until the end when you were talking about chill, which is such a kind of everyday idea. What is your definition of chill? What do you mean by chill vibes? Is there a definition of that? Is it a state of mind? Is it an ambience? What is it?
Yeah, I guess it's an ambience. Maybe it's a feeling, and maybe it's a backdrop to a story. Maybe it's lighting, and I think these kinds of feelings can be supported by architecture and can be supported by design, especially interiors.
It's funny because I remember the first time I encountered the word chill, I was with a bunch of people, went to watch a football match at the house of a guy I didn't really know very well. And then the match finished, and then there was that awkward moment when everyone was like, do we stay at this guy's house or do we leave? We've come around here because he's got the satellite subscription. And so I said to him, is it okay if I stay? And he said, yeah, I'm just gonna chill. And I was like, I don't know what that means. Does that mean I can stay or I can't stay? Of course, that was a long time ago. So I guess that was my introduction to the era of chill. And it's funny because I was confused by what it meant. And now we have someone like you who's got a very sort of intelligent approach to architecture, putting that word on a shelf along with all kinds of other complex terms. Why did you focus on the whole chill thing?
I think moving to California did a number, obviously. Los Angeles is an interesting place. Again, going to be working on a Manifesto project with DC Bit people. Nick Griffin, if you're watching, what's up? You know, but I think this idea of Los Angeles being a super chill city is worth thinking about. You know, the sun sets every day, you know, the palm trees, some of the graphic motifs that keep on recurring in the popular media. I think again, as an aesthetic and compositional breakdown, I think LA gave me the chills, I guess.
And in a way, it's a term that defines our epoch. So you talk about Netflix and chill and things like that. And the only comparable term I can think of before that was cool. There was a time when you had to be cool, and he's cool, she's cool, that's cool. It was like a word that got thrown around without really anyone ever defining it, until somebody wrote a book. I'm not sure who it was, but somebody wrote a book which defined what cool meant. It was something that just everyone assumed you either had or didn't have. Chill's a bit more democratic though, isn't it, than cool? You're not, there's not sort of the unchill crowd, is there? It's something everyone can aspire to.
Yeah, everyone can chill. I think it's for everybody.
Is it a bit of a passive, lazy way of existing though? Is it a desirable state to be chilled?
I mean, you know, that's maybe, that's an interesting thought, because we're all stuck at home, at least United States, England, you know, I think most of Europe, a lot of places right now, everyone's stuck at home. So the idea of feeling lazy is becoming a bit more complicated. It used to be that I'm just going to chill at home, but now if I'm at home, I'm working. In fact, you know, if anything, we're all working a lot more at home. And so the, let's say, sanctuary that used to be the domestic space where you can be lazy and chill, suddenly programmatically it's double layered at the moment. I think, you know, we're at the same time unable to chill, but in the space of chill.
I find I have to fit my chill moments in between other activities. Like I just had a little nap in the garden, to be honest, because I woke up so early, got up so early this morning. It was a pretty intense day. But how did you start out? Did you start out with wanting to be an architect? Did you start out with wanting to be a comic book illustrator, or did you want to do both? Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and how you got into the discipline.
Well, I was originally born in Taiwan, where, you know, I guess the manga culture exists in Taiwan. I mean, we sort of inherited it from Japan. So the manga culture was so prevalent that let's say manga / anime literacy as far as, you know, Taiwanese kids who grew up in the 80s, as far as I know, everyone had some degree of fascination with either manga or anime, boys and girls, everyone. And the literacy was so high that, you know, I would say you just show somebody a few pages, they can pick up the pace and understand the rhythm. So yes, I definitely wanted to draw cartoons for sure. But at the same time, I think architecture, as far as, you know, a proper profession that would have been interesting to pursue, I really thought about our relationship with history and culture. Architecture has always been the ultimate documentation of eras, and, you know, I found that to be super interesting. You know, every archaeological discussion, eventually we talk about the architectural plan somehow as to understand a way of life. And so the combination of these two, you know, influences drove me to be pursuing architecture. I grew up later in Toronto, in Canada, and, you know, decided that I'm going to just give this a stab. And along the way, you know, I at times would try to represent the drawings or represent the projects that I developed through cartoons. And one thing led to another, things caught on and just kept going with it.
Your work has a definite aesthetic to it, like kind of a compartmentalized spaces, a sort of asymmetry. Does that come from the cartoons?
I think so. I think the cartoons in themselves have a compositional consistency that maybe got hardwired for me at least. Yeah, I think as I was mentioning at the beginning, I think the cartoonish architecture is more of a sensibility choice than a medium choice. Yeah.
And then your work often has this sort of grid with rectangles and squares and egg shapes, which is almost like the storyboard of a cartoon itself. So you're like what do you call it? When you're doing a cartoon, what do you call them? Are they cells or are they pictures or whatever? But you
Right.
create
Yeah.
physical space that almost represents narrative space in the cartoons.
Right, bricks and bubbles.
Is that what they're called? Bricks?
Bricks and bubbles, yeah.
So tell us about the cartoon narrative then, with the 5,000 years in the future. And that's a kind of like a narrative vehicle to approach architecture. But talk us through the story. What happens in the cartoon? These characters, what they disappear off into space and then come back to Earth? Because it could be a parable for what's going to happen with our planet. So tell us,
For sure.
what's the story?
Well, in the story, man returns from space travel only to encounter, a stranger who's from the future. Similar to the way that Planet of the Apes from 1968 ended or took place. And so this person, I guess this person was greeted by a future archaeologist who's got a lot of questions. Obviously, it's a rare specimen to be able to speak to someone who's a living, millennia-year-old being. So we're asking this and that, So it turns out the thesis of this future archaeologist is the average taste of the early 21st century. And so his first question was architecture this or that? This being the archaeological finds. This being the books that they read about the buildings. So they read, let's say from the academic records, architecture was a certain way. For example, if you uncover things from the AA files, where from Columbia University or wherever else, architecture, especially let's say progressive architecture, looked nothing like the archaeological finds. So was architecture this or that? I think that was the central question, to which the question was totally ignored by the person who's just super upset that everyone's dead. But I was invited by Jimenez Lai to work on an installation in Korea, in Seoul. The title of her proposal was Uncovering the Future, Unearthing Future. So I thought it was a really appropriate, occasion to try to extract some of those ideas and construct something on the site of the last king of Korea, the palace of last king of Korea. The last king of Korea, I guess he died in the early 20th century, and this event that was organized by Museum of Modern Contemporary Art in Korea was to sort of commemorate the anniversary of his 100th year, the date of his death, as well as celebrate, art and architecture from both domestically Korean but foreign allies.
And how is this lockdown situation affecting you through your work? Is it forcing you to work in a different way? Are you adapting your architecture to the circumstances? Is there another cartoon strip in the offing that will be a sort of parable of lockdown?
I'm definitely working on something now. So if the question is it affecting where I work? Yeah, totally. I'm without my foam cutter, and without my light table, and without so many of the tools that I really love and rely on. It's hard. And there's also, I don't know how everybody else is, but because I teach, I spend a lot more time on Zoom now. I spent so much time on Zoom. Makes me wonder how we were so efficient in the past. This is actually a really effective way. But yeah, no, I'm definitely working on something at the moment. I'm thinking about, this feeling of being distant from each other. I'm drawing another comic at the moment.
You're working on a comic based on these times.
I'm working on, yes, I am, yeah.
And it sounds like you saw the conversation with Space Popular yesterday, or at least enough to twig their background. But they were talking a lot about virtual reality and how this situation could finally push virtual reality into being something that becomes an everyday tool for us. Is that something that you've been experiencing? Is it something that you have thoughts on, or something that you use?
Yeah, no, by the way, I really loved their presentation, and the interview was so brilliant. So if Space Popular is watching, amazing, great, so great. I agree with them. I think they were talking about, I guess, looking at some of the tools that we have at hand as the contemporary fax machines, and this sudden avalanche moment from which we transition between old conventional cell phones to smartphones. I think that's something like that is bound to happen. I think it's not only going to happen through these ways. I think, it's going to happen to the way that we travel, the way that we make transactions. Every aspect of our life is going to receive a massive impact. But I also agree with them in that, one of the other things that they said was, but there's nothing that's going to replace human interaction in person, the quality of sound. I think they said something about quality of sound and quality of space between people. There are these intangible communications that can't really be had only via the screen. So things will change, but things will also be the same.
So it's very interesting talking about sound, because visually Zoom is a great tool, but the sound is often, people talk about getting exhausted on Zoom calls, and for me it's the sound. It's like having to focus your ears, if that's something that's actually possible. You can get away with a glitchy screen, but glitchy audio really does your head in, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally. I think sometimes if I am flying, for example, from on an airplane, after I land, I'm super tired, and I always wonder why that is, because I just sat there for hours. Why would I be tired if I just sat there for hours? But when you think about the vibration that you sort of experience the entire time that you're sitting on the airplane, it's maybe not so dissimilar to the way that our ears are adjusting to different forms of vibrations. And so it's a different type of exhaustion, I think.
Zoom is the new flying then.
Yeah.
and finally, Jimenez, your project, when are you going to get your first big scale project? You're showing these ginormous skyscrapers that, building for 80 million people. Is there something in the pipeline that's going to allow you to step things up a little bit in scale?
I hope so. We're always trying, one step at a time. I think there were, obviously hits and misses. There's been a few opportunities where we might have been able to make that jump, but we haven't been able to. But I what's that Wayne Gretzky line? You miss 100% of the shots you don't take. I think that's from Wayne Gretzky. But I think we're just going to keep shooting.
And what are you working on at the moment? Is there anything you can share with us that's coming up?
Alongside the Manifesto project I was talking about with, DCBID to write about downtown LA, there are, I can show you an abstract sketch of, the building proposal that's coming up. I can't talk too much about it, but I think it's super exciting and interesting, I actually can't talk way too much about it. But there are these things that, for example, this thing hopefully works out. I'm currently collaborating with a few good friends. For example, Frank Clementi and Julie Smith Clementi. I don't know if they're watching, so hello. You know, there are these potential building proposals that we're, you know, going after. So I don't know, I can't say something way too specific about it, but between the scale of something like buildings and writing, I'm still working on a few essays that, you know, that needs to get out. Those two.
The picture you showed of downtown LA really struck me, actually, because I was in LA in September and I went to see Alex McDowell in downtown LA in his studio, and then I walked from there to SciArc, and I'm not sure if it was the same bridge that you took your picture from. It might have been the next one across. I spent a lot of time on that bridge taking photos because it was the first time I'd ever been to that place, which we know about so much from the movies. The Grease scene where they're racing down the river.
That's right, yeah.
And then unfortunately, later that night, my phone got stolen, so I don't have any of those movies. But talk a little bit about that extraordinary landscape. It's huge, isn't it? And what you say you're working on a project for it. Like, what can be done with that massive sort of nothing space, which has a real strong personality, but is like, it's all infrastructure, isn't it?
It's all infrastructure. Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things I've thought about a lot of the riverbank of the LA River is that, you know, because once upon a time it was one of the favorite playgrounds for graffiti. And what's graffiti other than a political claim of a territory? You know, I think, you know, gang members do it as far back as, you know, if we talk about the history of rock art, these glyphs that we might find are also ways in which we demarcate either differences or proclaim presence. And I think what's super interesting about LA's approach to sort of redact everybody else's claim is to, you know, so you can see that along the riverbank, all of the graffitis are whited out by the city of LA. And I find that, you know, act of redacting everybody else's graffiti in itself to be a graffiti by LA, and their political choice of color is white. I mean, I'm sort of thinking a lot more about, I mean, I'm not answering your question directly with regards to what can be done there, but I think the riverbank is definitely a super interesting space to consider, both as a semi-elevation, but also a kind of semi-plan. You know, fulfilling these ideas of life on the oblique.
Frank Gehry announced that project a few years back to sort of renaturalize the river. Is that happening, and is that section of the river going to be part of it?
No, I mean, is that happening? I'm not super sure. These projects, you know, they get announced and sometimes they don't happen. I hope it happens. It looks like a really good proposal. But no, the stretch that he's dealing with is outside of downtown. In fact, the stretch that I'm showing is not properly downtown. It's close to downtown. Yeah.
We've got a couple of questions from our online audience. Robin asks, will firms be implementing AI learning to assist in compliance or certain functions of architecture? I'm not sure I understand the question, do you?
Will firms be assisting AI learning?
Will companies be implementing AI learning to assist in the compliance of certain functions of architecture? Let's pass on that one. If Robin's listening, Robin, if you could re-ask your question before the end of that. And our good friend Abdo asks, how do you translate your ideas? Do you start by sketching? Do ideas come like wildfire, one after the other, and how do you record them?
I mean, conversations really help. You know, I really love chatting about architecture with you know, friends, colleagues, students. I mean, there are times that, I mean, obviously, yes, how do you translate it? Sketching helps as well. But the thing that I really love about chatting about architecture is that, you know, through chatting, you sort of get to articulate some of the details about certain ideas. that so that they won't remain ideas. You know, I think these are, yeah, just talking more. I mean, when sometimes people go to let's say restaurants or bars, they talk about maybe sports or something. I would just want to talk about architecture. I think that's a different type of hobby.
Well, great. It sounds like you've been enjoying your hobby for the last 40 minutes then. Glad to help you out with that.
Thank you.
So great to see you again, Jimenez, and
thanks, Marcus.
stay safe.
Yeah, you too.
See you in the real world before too long.
Thanks for this. Yeah, yeah.